The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the Metropolitan County Courthouse, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Dr. Sarah Thompson stood quietly in line, waiting for her turn in traffic court. She was wearing simple blue jeans, a comfortable gray sweater, and practical flat shoes, the same casual outfit she had worn while testing new robotics equipment in her lab the previous weekend when she received the traffic ticket. The courthouse buzzed with typical Monday morning activity. People shuffled in and out, their footsteps echoing off the marble walls. Security guards directed visitors through metal detectors, and lawyers hurried past with briefcases and coffee cups in hand. Sarah checked her watch, 9:15 a.m. She had arrived early for her 9:30 a.m. hearing, not wanting to give anyone any reason to doubt her responsibility. As Sarah waited, she observed Judge Richard Barrett handling the cases before hers. He was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing the traditional black robe of his position. His reputation preceded him, known for being strict and traditional in his rulings. Sarah noticed how he spoke differently to different people, his tone changing subtly with each case. "Next case," the bailiff called out. "Citation number 2024 CT 789. Sarah stepped forward, her steps confident despite her nervousness. She had prepared all her documentation, including the technical readings from her car's computer system that would explain the malfunction that led to her ticket. As a robotics expert with 15 years of experience, she understood the complexity of modern vehicle systems better than most. Judge Barrett barely looked up from his papers as Sarah approached the podium. His eyes skimmed over her casual attire, and a slight frown crossed his face. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows, making his expression appear even sterner. "Ms. Thompson," he said, emphasizing the Ms. with a hint of dismissal in his voice. "You're here for exceeding the speed limit by 15 miles per hour on Highland Avenue. How do you plead?" "Your Honor," Sarah began politely, "I'd like to explain. My vehicle experienced a computer system malfunction that—" Judge Barrett cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Miss Thompson, a simple guilty or not guilty will suffice. We have a full docket today." Sarah noticed how different his tone was from when he had addressed the white businessman just minutes before. That case had involved a similar traffic violation, but Judge Barrett had listened patiently to that driver's full explanation about a family emergency. "Not guilty, Your Honor," Sarah replied, maintaining her composure. She reached into her folder to retrieve the technical documentation she had brought. "Miss Thompson," Judge Barrett said, looking at her over his glasses, "the officer's report clearly states that you were traveling at 50 miles per hour in a 35 zone. These machines don't make mistakes." Sarah wanted to explain that, actually, they did make mistakes. She wanted to tell them about the specific malfunction in the car's speed control module, something she had discovered and documented. She wanted to share her expertise in robotics and computer systems, but the judge's dismissive attitude made it clear he wasn't interested. The courthouse clock ticked loudly in the background as Judge Barrett shuffled through his papers. The morning sun had shifted, and now the courtroom felt uncomfortably warm. Other waiting defendants watched the proceedings with varying degrees of interest. "Given the clear evidence and your lack of a proper defense," Judge Barrett declared, "I'm finding you guilty and imposing a fine of $300, plus court costs. Pay the clerk on your way out." He banged his gavel, already looking past Sarah to the next case. Sarah stood there for a moment, feeling a mix of frustration and resignation. She had faced similar prejudgments before in her professional life, but it never got easier. With dignity, she gathered her unused documentation and turned to leave. As she walked toward the clerk's office, Sarah's phone buzzed with a reminder about her presentation later that day, the one she would be giving to the state's judicial system about implementing new automated courthouse technology. She allowed herself a small smile, knowing that sometimes life had its own way of revealing truth. The clerk's office was busy with people lining up to pay their fines. Sarah stood in line, her documentation folder still tucked under her arm, watching as people ahead of her handed over their credit cards and cash. The morning's unfair treatment in court still bothered her, but she remained professional and calm on the outside. "Next," called the clerk, a young woman with kind eyes. As Sarah stepped forward, she noticed Judge Barrett walking through a side door, heading towards the courthouse's main conference room. He was carrying a leather briefcase and checking his watch, clearly in a hurry for something. Sarah handed her credit card to the clerk, thinking about how differently things might have gone if she'd worn her usual work clothes, the tailored suits and heels she used for business meetings. But why should someone's clothes or appearance matter in a court of law? She had dressed casually that day because she needed to go straight to the robotics lab after this to prepare for her afternoon presentation. "Ma'am," the clerk's voice brought Sarah back to the present. "Would you like a receipt?" Just then, a commotion near the conference room caught everyone's attention. A man in a suit was struggling with the new security system at the conference room entrance. Judge Barrett stood behind him, looking increasingly annoyed. The security panel was flashing red repeatedly, denying them access. Sarah knew exactly what was wrong. She had helped design that system after all. The new biometric scanners were sensitive to certain lighting conditions, something they were still working to perfect. She could fix it in less than a minute, but after her experience in court, she hesitated. The courthouse's head of security approached the group, looking worried. Sarah overheard him saying something about calling technical support, which would take at least an hour to arrive. She knew that the mandatory technology seminar was scheduled to start in 15 minutes. Sarah took a deep breath and made a decision. Walking over to the group, she cleared her throat politely. "Excuse me," she said, "I might be able to help with that." Judge Barrett turned, recognition flickering across his face. His expression changed from annoyance to surprise, then to something like embarrassment. "Miss Thompson?" "It's actually Dr. Thompson," she corrected him gently. "I'm familiar with this system. May I?" She gestured toward the security panel. The head of security looked skeptical but stepped aside. Sarah approached the panel and quickly accessed its diagnostic menu through a series of precise touches. Her fingers moved confidently across the screen as she adjusted the sensor sensitivity settings. Within moments, the red light turned green, and the door clicked open. "How did you?" the security head started to ask. "Dr. Thompson is our keynote speaker for today's technology seminar," a new voice announced. Sarah turned to see Linda Martinez, the courthouse's chief technology officer, walking towards them. She's one of the leading experts in robotics and automated security systems in the country. Judge Barrett's face had turned a deep shade of red. He stood there, briefcase clutched tightly, as Linda continued. "Dr. Thompson's company designed our new security system. She's here today to talk about the future of automated courthouse technology." The same people who had watched Sarah in traffic court earlier were now watching this scene unfold. Some were hiding smiles behind their hands, while others were openly staring at Judge Barrett's obvious discomfort. "I believe we have a few minutes before the seminar begins," Sarah said professionally. "Judge Barrett, you'll be attending, correct? I'd be happy to explain how these systems work, including the vehicle computer systems I tried to discuss earlier." The judge nodded stiffly, unable to meet her eyes. "Yes, of course," he managed to say. As they walked into the conference room together, Sarah could feel the weight of the morning's earlier injustice lifting slightly. Sometimes the best response to prejudice wasn't anger or confrontation, but simply letting your actions and achievements speak for themselves. The conference room was already half full of judges, lawyers, and court administrators. As Sarah walked to the front of the room to set up her presentation, she couldn't help but notice Judge Barrett choosing a seat in the very back row, still clutching his briefcase like a shield. The conference room was packed with legal professionals as Sarah Thompson took her place at the podium. The projector hummed to life, displaying her first slide, "The Future of Automated Justice, Integrating AI and Robotics in Our Courts." In the back row, Judge Barrett shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence notably diminished. Linda Martinez, the chief technology officer, stood up to introduce their speaker. "We are honored to have Dr. Sarah Thompson with us today. She holds 3 patents in robotics technology, earned her PhD from MIT, and currently leads one of the most innovative tech companies in our state. Her work has transformed how we think about automation in legal systems." As Linda spoke, Sarah noticed several judges and lawyers turning to look at Judge Barrett. Word had already spread through the courthouse about the morning's traffic court incident. A few people were whispering, and one clerk was clearly trying not to smile. "Thank you, Linda," Sarah began, her voice clear and confident. "Before we dive into courthouse automation, I'd like to start with something relevant to our daily lives: vehicle computer systems." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed diagram of a car's speed control module. Judge Barrett sank lower in his chair as Sarah continued. Modern vehicles are essentially computers on wheels. They can malfunction in ways that aren't immediately obvious. For example, a speed control module might display incorrect readings due to software glitches or sensor failures. Several heads turned again toward Judge Barrett, who was now staring intently at his notebook. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor as she explained the exact type of malfunction that had led to her traffic ticket that morning, though she never directly mentioned the incident. These systems are complex, she demonstrated, pulling up simulation data on the screen. What might look like speeding could actually be a calibration error. This is why it's crucial to consider technical evidence when evaluating traffic violations. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Judge Barrett's earlier dismissal of Sarah's technical explanation now seemed not just unfair, but embarrassingly ignorant. Several other judges were taking detailed notes, clearly recognizing the importance of this information for their own traffic court sessions. Sarah moved on to discuss the courthouse's new security systems, explaining how they worked and demonstrating their features using real-time data. Her expertise was undeniable as she fielded complex technical questions from the audience, providing clear, thoughtful answers that everyone could understand. During the Q&A session, a young lawyer raised her hand. Dr. Thompson, what inspired you to focus on courthouse automation? Sarah smiled, remembering her own experiences as a young black woman in both the tech industry and the legal system. I believe that automated systems, when properly designed and implemented, can help reduce human bias and ensure more consistent justice. However, she added, making brief eye contact with Judge Barrett, these systems must be properly understood and their limitations recognized. As the session continued, Sarah noticed Judge Barrett taking out his phone and quietly looking up her credentials. She could see the moment he found her impressive list of achievements. His eyes widened slightly as he scrolled through her professional profile. And that brings us to our next phase, Sarah continued, showing slides of the upcoming courthouse improvements. We're installing advanced AI-assisted filing systems, automated transcription services, and enhanced security protocols. These changes will make our justice system more efficient and, hopefully, more equitable. The presentation concluded with a standing ovation. As people began to file out of the conference room, Sarah could see Judge Barrett remaining in his seat, still processing everything he had witnessed. The same man who had dismissed her so quickly in traffic court was now faced with undeniable evidence of her expertise and accomplishments. Linda approached Sarah as she packed up her presentation materials. That was excellent, Dr. Thompson, though I couldn't help but notice Judge Barrett seemed a bit uncomfortable. Sometimes, Sarah replied quietly, the best lesson about prejudice isn't taught through words, but through actions. I hope today helped demonstrate that. After the presentation, Sarah sat in the courthouse cafeteria, taking a quick lunch break before her next meeting. She had ordered a sandwich and was reviewing emails on her phone when she noticed several judges and lawyers looking her way, speaking in hushed tones. The morning's events had clearly become the talk of the courthouse. 2 tables away, Judge Barrett sat alone with an untouched cup of coffee. He kept glancing in Sarah's direction, clearly struggling with his thoughts. The proud, dismissive judge from traffic court was gone, replaced by someone who looked troubled and unsure of himself. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her assistant. CNN wants to interview you about the new robotics patent. She smiled, remembering how Judge Barrett had acted when she tried to explain technical details to him just hours ago. As she responded to the message, a young intern approached her table. Dr. Thompson, the intern said nervously. I saw your presentation. I'm studying engineering and, well, I'm the only black woman in my class. Would you mind if I asked you a few questions? Of course not. Sarah replied warmly, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Please join me. As they talked, Sarah noticed more people gathering nearby, pretending to be busy but clearly listening. Judge Barrett hadn't moved from his spot, but he was now close enough to hear their conversation. How do you handle it? The intern asked quietly. When people assume you don't know what you're talking about just because of how you look. Sarah thought carefully before answering, knowing her words might reach beyond just this young student. I let my work speak for itself, she said. Like today's presentation, I didn't need to tell anyone I was qualified. I showed them through my knowledge and actions. The intern nodded eagerly. I read about your latest patent, the one about AI-assisted medical robots. That must have been amazing to develop. From his table, Judge Barrett's head snapped up. Sarah could see him pulling out his phone again, probably looking up the patent she'd mentioned. She continued her conversation with the intern, explaining the complex robotic systems she'd developed over the years. More students and courthouse staff gathered around, asking questions about her work. Sarah answered each one patiently, sharing stories about her journey from a curious child who loved taking apart computers to becoming a leading expert in robotics. "Did you always know you wanted to work in technology?" someone asked. Sarah shook her head. "Not exactly, but I knew I wanted to make systems that would help create fairness in the world. That's why I focus on legal and medical technology, areas where accuracy and unbiased judgment are crucial." Judge Barrett was now openly listening, his coffee still untouched. Sarah could see the impact her words were having on him as she described the importance of looking past first impressions and surface judgments. "My team is actually working on a new project," Sarah continued, aware of her growing audience. "We're developing AI systems that can help identify potential bias in legal decisions. The goal is to support judges and lawyers in making more informed, fair choices." Several judges in the cafeteria shifted uncomfortably at this, but Sarah noticed some were nodding in agreement. Judge Barrett stared into his coffee cup, his face reflecting deep thought. As lunch hour ended, people began returning to their offices. The young intern thanked Sarah warmly and left with new confidence in her step. Sarah gathered her things, preparing for her afternoon meetings with the courthouse technology team. Just then, a courthouse clerk rushed up to her. "Dr. Thompson? Judge Barrett's office called. He'd like to speak with you when you have a moment." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. Sometimes the hardest reality checks were the most necessary ones. She checked her schedule. She had a few minutes before her next meeting. "Please tell Judge Barrett I'll stop by his office in 5 minutes," she replied professionally. As she walked toward the elevator, Sarah could feel the weight of many eyes following her. In just one day, she had shifted from being dismissed in traffic court to being recognized as someone whose opinion mattered deeply to the future of the entire legal system. Sarah stood outside Judge Barrett's office, her hand poised to knock. Through the frosted glass, she could see his silhouette as he paced back and forth. The nameplate on his door gleamed in the afternoon light. "Honorable Richard Barrett, District Court Judge." After the events of the day, the word honorable seemed to carry extra weight. Before she could knock, voices from around the corner caught her attention. 2 other judges were discussing her presentation. "Did you know she built the entire security system for the new children's court building?" One judge said, "My colleague in Boston says their courthouse is trying to get her company's technology too." "And to think Barrett just fined her this morning without even looking at her evidence," the other replied. "I heard she's got more patents than half our tech department combined." Sarah knocked on the door, and the conversations in the hallway quickly hushed. Judge Barrett's voice, notably less confident than it had been in traffic court, called out, "Come in." The office was large but simple, with law books lining the walls and certificates hanging in neat rows. Judge Barrett had removed his judicial robe and sat behind his desk in a regular suit. He looked older than he had that morning and much more tired. "Dr. Thompson," he began, standing up as she entered. "Please have a seat." The formal tone from traffic court was gone, replaced by something close to respect. As Sarah sat down, she noticed a printout on his desk. It was her professional profile, along with news articles about her robotics work. One headline read, "MIT graduate revolutionizes courthouse technology." "I've been doing some research," Judge Barrett said, gesturing to the papers. "Your work in automation and robotics is remarkable. The children's court system you designed has apparently reduced processing times by 60%. Sarah nodded but remained quiet, letting him continue. The afternoon sun streamed through his office window, casting long shadows across the room. "The truth is," he went on, his voice heavy with realization, "I made assumptions this morning. Assumptions that were not only unfair but completely wrong." He picked up another paper, the technical documentation she had tried to show him in traffic court. "Your explanation about the vehicle computer malfunction," he said, "it was completely valid. I've had 3 other judges come to my office since your presentation, telling me about similar cases they've encountered. The clock on his wall ticked loudly in the silence that followed. Outside, they could hear the usual courthouse bustle, people talking, phones ringing, doors opening and closing. "Do you know why I became a judge?" he asked suddenly, surprising both Sarah and himself with the question. "I wanted to ensure justice was served fairly, but today I was the one who failed to be fair." Sarah leaned forward slightly. "It's not just about today," she said calmly. "It's about a pattern of assumptions that affects people like me every day. The young intern you saw me talking to in the cafeteria? She faces the same challenges I do." Judge Barrett nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn on his face. "The court administrator told me you're implementing new bias detection software in our systems," he said. "I'd like to learn more about it. Actually, I'd like to learn more about all of it. The vehicle systems, the security protocols, everything I dismissed this morning." Just then, Sarah's phone buzzed. Her next meeting was about to start. As she stood to leave, Judge Barrett spoke again, his voice sincere. "Dr. Thompson, I owe you an apology. And more than that, I owe you my gratitude. You've opened my eyes to something I should have seen long ago." Sarah paused at the door. "Judge Barrett, sometimes the most important justice we can serve is acknowledging our own mistakes and learning from them." As she walked out, she could see through the frosted glass that Judge Barrett had sat down heavily in his chair, still looking at her credentials spread across his desk. The afternoon sun had shifted, and now his office was filled with warm, clear light, much like the clarity that had finally broken through his prejudiced assumptions. 2 days after the technology seminar, Sarah sat in her company's downtown office, reviewing designs for a new courthouse automation system. The wall-to-wall windows offered a stunning view of the city, a testament to how far she'd come from her humble beginnings. Her assistant's voice came through the intercom, interrupting her work. "Dr. Thompson, Judge Barrett is here to see you." Sarah looked up from her computer, somewhat surprised. Although they had spoken briefly in his office, she hadn't expected him to come to her workplace. "Please send him in," she replied. Judge Barrett entered, looking different from the imposing figure he'd been in court. He wore a regular business suit instead of his judicial robes, and he carried a thick folder under his arm. His face showed signs of someone who hadn't slept well. "Dr. Thompson," he said, "thank you for seeing me without an appointment." He glanced around her office, taking in the robotics prototypes displayed on shelves and the awards lining the walls. One award caught his eye: Innovation in Justice, Automated Systems for Equitable Courts. "Please, sit down." Sarah gestured to a chair. "What brings you here today?" Judge Barrett placed the folder on her desk and opened it. Inside were hundreds of cases he had presided over in the past year. "I've been reviewing my old cases," he said quietly. "After what happened with your traffic violation, I couldn't help but wonder how many other times I might have made unfair judgments." Sarah leaned forward, interested. The morning sun filtered through the windows, illuminating the space between them. "I found patterns," he continued, his voice heavy with realization. "Patterns I'm not proud of. Different fines for similar violations. Different listening times for different people. All based on assumptions." A cleaning robot that Sarah's company had developed quietly moved past her office door, its sensors ensuring it didn't interrupt their conversation. Judge Barrett watched it pass, a reminder of the expertise he had so quickly dismissed days ago. "The truth is," he said, turning back to Sarah, "I came here today because a proper apology couldn't wait. What I did in court wasn't just unfair to you, it was a violation of everything I'm supposed to stand for as a judge." Sarah remained quiet, letting him continue. Outside her office, engineers and developers walked past, many of them women and people of color whom she had specifically recruited and mentored. "I've spoken with the court administrator," Judge Barrett said. "I'm initiating a comprehensive review of our court's practices. But more than that, I wanted to ask for your help." Sarah raised an eyebrow, curious. "My help?" "Your company's bias detection software, the one you mentioned in your presentation. I'd like to be the first judge to volunteer for the pilot program, and," he paused, gathering courage, "I'd like to learn from you. About the technology, yes, but more importantly, about the experiences I've been blind to." A gentle hum from the robotics lab next door filled the momentary silence. Sarah could see the sincerity in his eyes, the genuine desire to change. Judge Barrett, she finally said, recognizing our biases is the first step to correcting them. Not everyone is willing to take that step. She stood up and walked to one of her shelves, picking up a small robot prototype. When we program these robots, they learn from their mistakes. They adjust their algorithms based on new information. Humans can do the same thing. Judge Barrett nodded, understanding the parallel. I've spent 30 years on the bench, he said, thinking I was serving justice. Now I realize I need to relearn what justice truly means. Sarah placed the prototype back on its shelf. The traffic fine, she said, it was never about the money. It was about being heard, being respected, being treated fairly. I know, he replied. I've already moved to have it dismissed, but that's just a small step. I'm hoping you'll help me take larger ones. As they discussed plans for implementing the bias detection software and training programs, the morning sun rose higher, casting fewer shadows in the office. It felt fitting, like illumination spreading through the darkness of old prejudices, making way for new understanding. 3 months after the traffic court incident, the Metropolitan County Courthouse looked different. New screens displayed wait times and case information in the lobby. Smart robots, designed by Sarah's company, guided visitors to their destinations. But the biggest changes weren't the ones you could see. Judge Barrett stood at the front of the courthouse's main conference room, addressing a group of 50 judges from across the state. Behind him, a large screen showed data from the new bias detection software that Sarah's team had installed. Let me be honest with you, he began, his voice carrying the weight of experience. 3 months ago, I made a mistake that opened my eyes. I let my biases affect my judgment, and in doing so, I nearly missed learning from one of the brightest minds in technology. The room was silent. In the back, Sarah sat quietly, watching the judge she had once faced in traffic court now leading the charge for change. She noticed how different he looked, more humble, more aware, more determined to make things right. The numbers don't lie, he continued, pointing to the screen. In the past 3 months, using Dr. Thompson's bias detection software, we've identified concerning patterns in our rulings. Different penalties for the same violations. Different treatment based on appearance. Different listening times based on assumptions. He clicked to the next slide, showing dramatic improvements in the court's fairness metrics since implementing the new system. But here's what happens when we let technology help us check our biases. A young black female judge raised her hand. How do we know the software itself isn't biased? Judge Barrett smiled and gestured to Sarah. Dr. Thompson, would you mind explaining? Sarah walked to the front of the room, her presence commanding immediate respect. Our software doesn't make decisions, she explained. It simply shows patterns in our existing decisions. It's like holding up a mirror to our own actions. As she demonstrated the system, Sarah could see the impact on the judges' faces. Some looked uncomfortable, others looked inspired, but all were paying close attention. Last week, Judge Barrett added, a defendant tried to explain a technical issue with his car's computer system. 3 months ago, I would have dismissed it. Instead, I listened. Turns out he was right, and we avoided making an unfair judgment. The atmosphere in the room had changed. Judges were taking notes, asking questions, sharing their own experiences with bias. One older judge admitted he had often dismissed technical explanations from younger defendants, assuming they were making excuses. This isn't just about traffic court, Sarah explained. It's about every decision we make based on what we think we know about people before they even speak. After the presentation, judges crowded around Sarah and Judge Barrett, eager to implement the system in their own courtrooms. The courthouse administrator announced that the program would be expanded to all departments within the month. In the hallway afterward, Sarah overheard 2 clerks talking about recent changes they'd noticed. Judge Barrett actually listens now, one said, really listens. And not just to some people, to everyone. Later that afternoon, Sarah sat in her old spot in traffic court, observing the changes. Judge Barrett was handling cases differently now. He took time with each person, asked questions, considered explanations. The bias detection tablet sat on his bench, its screen glowing softly, a constant reminder to check his assumptions. A young woman in casual clothes approached the bench, nervous about explaining her situation. Sarah watched as Judge Barrett leaned forward, gave her his full attention, and actually listened to her story. Sometimes, Judge Barrett had said during his presentation, the greatest justice comes not from our judgments, but from our willingness to question them. As Sarah left the courthouse that day, she passed the spot where she had stood 3 months ago, frustrated and dismissed. Now that same spot had a new sign. Welcome to Metropolitan County Courthouse, where justice meets understanding. The afternoon sun streamed through the courthouse windows, and Sarah could see Judge Barrett in his office, carefully reviewing case files with his new bias detection tablet. Real change, she realized, didn't just come from new technology. It came from people willing to admit their mistakes and do better. 1 year had passed since the day Sarah Thompson walked into traffic court. The Metropolitan County Courthouse had become a model for judicial systems across the country. Today, she stood on a different stage, the National Judicial Conference in Washington, D.C. The grand ballroom was packed with over 500 judges, lawyers, and court administrators from every state. Judge Barrett sat in the front row, no longer the proud, dismissive figure he'd once been. Next to him sat the young intern from the courthouse cafeteria, now a graduated engineer working on Sarah's team. When I walked into traffic court that day, Sarah began her keynote speech. I wasn't Dr. Thompson, the MIT graduate with 3 patents. I wasn't the robotics expert who had designed courthouse security systems. I was just another person being judged by appearances. The room was silent, hundreds of legal professionals hanging on her every word. On screens around the room, data showed how bias detection software had improved judicial fairness in courts across the country. But something unexpected happened, she continued. What started as an unfair judgment became the catalyst for real change. And that change began with one judge willing to admit his mistake and do better. Judge Barrett smiled softly, remembering his own journey. In the past year, he had become known as a leading voice for judicial reform, speaking openly about his experience and encouraging other judges to confront their biases. Sarah clicked to her next slide, showing the impressive results. In the past year, courts using our bias detection system have shown a 70% reduction in discriminatory sentencing patterns. Appeal rates have dropped by 45%, but the numbers only tell part of the story. She gestured to the young intern turned engineer. The real change is in the lives we touched, the people who now feel heard in our courtrooms. The young professionals who see that their expertise will be respected, regardless of how they look. The presentation included video testimonials from people whose cases have been handled differently because of the new systems. One woman spoke about how Judge Barrett had listened carefully to her technical explanation, just as he had failed to do with Sarah a year ago. Our technology doesn't make decisions, Sarah explained. It simply helps us see the decisions we're making more clearly. The real change comes from people willing to look in that mirror and adjust their perspective. After the speech, judges from across the country lined up to speak with Sarah and Judge Barrett. Many shared their own stories of confronting biases they hadn't known they carried. Others asked about implementing the system in their courts. Later that evening, at the conference dinner, Sarah sat with Judge Barrett and his family. His teenage daughter was especially excited. She had just been accepted to an engineering program and wanted to follow in Sarah's footsteps. You know, Judge Barrett said quietly, that traffic ticket was the most important fine I ever issued, because it was the last time I made a judgment without really listening. The conference organizer approached their table with news. The American Bar Association had voted to make bias detection training mandatory for all judges nationwide. Sarah's software would be the standard tool used in this training. As Sarah looked around the room, she saw something that would have been unimaginable a year ago. Judges of all backgrounds openly discussing their biases and how to overcome them. The wall between the bench and the public was coming down, replaced by understanding and respect. Sometimes, Sarah said in her closing remarks, the greatest changes come from our biggest mistakes. It's not about being perfect. It's about being willing to learn and grow. The story of the traffic ticket had become a teaching moment in judicial training programs across the country. But more than that, it had become a reminder that true justice requires more than just following laws. It requires opening our minds to possibilities we might have dismissed. As the conference ended, Sarah and Judge Barrett stood together for a photo that would appear in legal journals nationwide. The caption would read, "Innovation meets justice. How one traffic stop changed the American legal system." The legacy of that morning in traffic court would continue to shape the justice system for years to come, proving that sometimes the most powerful changes start with a simple willingness to listen and learn.